All right, guys, here we go. So here's our first section for our Chapter 10 notes. We're going to start talking about Thomas Jefferson taking office. So, election of 1800 was very closely contested. You'll remember so far we talked about George Washington's presidency, and you guys should have read about John Adams' presidency as well. The election of 1800, very, very close. The Federalists actually make it so extreme that they threaten civil war if Thomas Jefferson's elected. Obviously, they don't follow through on that, but it's a pretty high-stakes deal, and that just kind of reflects the seriousness with which this election takes place. Republicans, on the other hand, accuse Adams of wanting to create a monarchy. It's just kind of like a tough deal, right? It's very dirty election, and tempers are really definitely high. Jefferson is able to defeat John Adams, which is good for the Republican Party, but there's an issue, which is that Thomas Jefferson and fellow Republican Aaron Burr tie with 73 electoral votes each. The issue here is then who gets to be president. The way elections work at this time is whoever gets the most electoral votes becomes president. Whoever gets the second most gets to become vice president. Well, here it's a straight tie, so there's some question as to who gets to do which. The election then goes to the House of Representatives. They get to choose president, but they're deadlocked for 6 straight days. They vote 36 times before Thomas Jefferson is finally elected president by Congress. Interestingly enough, Alexander Hamilton, who is a Federalist, the opposite of the Republican Party, is actually the one who helps Thomas Jefferson get elected. He and Aaron Burr pretty much hate each other, and that's really going to start a feud between Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton to the point where Aaron Burr will actually kill Alexander Hamilton in a duel, which we'll talk about on this page. So, to avoid further problems, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution is passed, where electors vote separately for president and vice president. So there will be a presidential election and a vice presidential election. Still different from the electoral system that we have today, but they saw it as an improvement. Again, hoped it would avoid problems with president and vice president. And like I said, Aaron Burr actually kills Alexander Hamilton in a duel over this whole issue. So, Jefferson is the first president to be inaugurated in Washington, D.C., which is a pretty big deal. And his goal was to make government less aristocratic. George Washington and John Adams had made the office of the president and government seem more kingly or fancy, I guess, for lack of a better term. And he wanted government to seem more accessible and normal. He walked to his inauguration rather than getting a ride or taking a coach or anything like that. And he also ended the custom of people bowing to the president. So you remember in one of the videos we watched, they said that you would have to bow to George Washington. He refused to shake people's hands. John Adams did the same. Jefferson started to kind of go back on that a little bit. Jefferson referred to his election as the Revolution of 1800. Essentially, he believed that he was going to change the way the country had been going and really wanted to make a difference, have a revolution. His first goal was to limit the power of the federal government. He believed that the federal government was way too strong, and he wanted to scale back the powers and things that they had done to try to make it more of what he believed government should be. He adopted a polity called laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire is a French term. It just means hands-off, and essentially it means that government should not interfere in the economy. You'll remember one of the big things that Federalists did was interfere with the economy. We talked about Alexander Hamilton's plans for our government and loans and this bank and all that kind of stuff. Thomas Jefferson didn't want any of that. Now, Jefferson also decided to reduce the number of people in government. He believed there were too many employees. And so he fired tax collectors, cut the number of U.S. diplomats. He cut the Army's budget in half, as well as the size of the Army. He also eliminated all federal taxes within the country. So the only taxes that our government got were on tariffs, which we'll talk about later is definitely going to cause some issues. And then he refunded the fines from the Sedition Act and released anybody that had been imprisoned under the Sedition Act, again, which is one of those laws passed by John Adams that sought to punish Republican journalists during his presidency. So again, you can see here already that Thomas Jefferson really wants to make some changes in our government and see things through a little bit of a different perspective, which is why, again, we refer to this as the Revolution of 1800. Jefferson didn't reverse all Federalist policies. He didn't come in, totally wipe the slate clean and start over. There were some cases where he did keep doing things that previous presidents had, either because he thought they were okay or because it would have been too difficult to change course. He did believe that we had to keep paying off our debts, so that was a policy he held over. And he also decided to keep on Federalist office holders as long as they promised to work hard for him. So people that had been hired as Federalists, he allowed them to keep their job as long as they agreed to kind of be on his side and help him out. Where things start to get dicey is with Supreme Court and appointing judges and things like that. And so Federalist Judge William Marbury gets fired from his job. Adams had been appointing judges in the last hours of office. So literally 11 p.m. on his last day of presidency, he's putting forward all of this paperwork to appoint all these Federalist judges before he loses control of the government. One of them was William Marbury. The Republicans didn't want to keep all of these last minute additions. And so they said, well, they hadn't been approved, so we're not going to accept them. And there becomes this big question of should they be allowed to be judges or not? And so Jefferson ordered Madison, this is Madison down here, to stop all the appointments and says, don't give these guys their jobs, don't give them their paperwork, essentially don't let them have their judgeships. So Marbury eventually sues the government, and the trial goes all the way up to the Supreme Court, which you'll remember we talked about is our highest court of appeal. And the Supreme Court rules on the case. The case is called Marbury versus Madison. And in this case, they made a unanimous ruling. A guy named John Marshall was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And he's the one that actually writes the opinion here. And so he's the one that writes the essay that says why the Supreme Court voted the way that they did. And it's interesting because they rule that the power of the courts comes from the Constitution and not from Congress. And so this is going to further separate those two branches of government. But it's also going to give a really, really specific power to the Supreme Court, which is the power of judicial review. Now, the case itself is not really significant. You don't need to know the details. Marbury, Madison, who did what, when it happened. What is important is that it established the power of judicial review. And what that means is that essentially it gave the Supreme Court the power to decide what the Constitution means. If a law should or couldn't be made, if a law is legal, if it's not legal, if it is a violation of rights, all of those sorts of things. And so this is a pretty big deal, and it's a pretty significant thing for the Supreme Court to decide and for a pretty significant power for the Supreme Court to have. And that's it. Section 2 will be our next video. We'll talk about the Louisiana Purchase and Exploration. Please make sure you're filling in your notes. If you missed anything, rewind it, go back. I know that I talked fast here today. Pause it if you need to, and I'll see you guys later.